Professor Marandi. Please talk about, if you could, your reaction to Ansarallah's announcement that it had down the F-18 fighter jet, which was said to have been downed by friendly fire of the U.S.'s own making, because right now the U.S. and the Israeli regimes are conducting an all-out war, or attempting to conduct an all-out war against Yemen, as a retaliation to their successful strikes into Tel Aviv. Could you talk about this and its significance? Because, as you said, with Syria, there was this kind of reprieve and an obvious victory for Israel, regardless of how involved it was or not in it. Now we see that the resistance isn't maybe as dead as a lot of people assumed it was after the fall of Syria.
No, and I think that the Israeli advance inside Syria and the strikes against the country, even though they've devastated excuse me, they've devastated the infrastructure, I don't think it's going to be good for the regime. It's not a smart move because it's only humiliating Jolani, it's humiliating Al Qaeda because of their indifference, it's humiliating Erdogan, who pretends to support Palestine yet has never done anything and continues to send oil to Netanyahu, cheap Baku oil to Netanyahu to help him run his genocide and continue his genocide. So I don't think it's a smart move by the regime. If I was, God forbid, a Zionist leader, I would not have advanced into Syria. I would have not have carried out all these heavy airstrikes. But of course, Netanyahu is trying to keep the public on his side, and so he does it and looks strong, and that makes him more popular inside Israel. But what it does is that it 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 exposes the regime further, and it causes problems for the people that the Israeli regime helped bring to power in Syria. Yemen, I think I didn't actually read the statement put out by the Yemeni armed forces, but my understanding is that it sort of implied that they fired the drones and missiles at the U.S. warships in a manner to create confusion, and that the Americans downed their own jet. I may be interpreting it wrong. I haven't read the statement myself, and I should have. But whether the Yemeni armed forces downed it or the Americans downed this jet that costs over $100 million each. It really doesn't matter. It just shows it shows the incompetence of the U.S. military, and it shows how difficult it is to deal with Yemen. And it also shows that no matter how much the United States bombs Yemen and murders citizens, which they've done repeatedly, Yemen continues to strike the Israeli regime. It continues to strike ships that break the siege on the Israeli regime, a siege that was put in place as since the Yemeni government, Ansarullah, said that they are implementing the Genocide Convention. And they said that as long as the genocide in Gaza is taking place, the siege will continue. So the Americans have failed in breaking the siege to help the Israelis carry out genocide more easily. That is extraordinary. It shows the resilience of the resistance. Hezbollah is very much intact, very much prepared in case the war goes on. And yes, there are people who've questioned Iran, but as I said before, the previous Iranian strike, it is inevitable, and this is also inevitable. The Iranians have calculations to make, especially after the fall of Syria. They have to prepare their air defenses. They have to prepare air defenses in case the Americans do anything foolish. And they also have to prepare their missiles and drones for the Persian Gulf in case the Americans do anything foolish. Because if the Americans enter the fight, the Iranians will have to strike back, and all those tiny countries in the Persian Gulf that have American bases, that would all, of course, lead to the end of oil and gas production in the Persian Gulf, which will lead to a global economic meltdown. But Iran has to prepare itself for all consequences. It has to prepare itself for some stupidity on behalf of the Americans. It has to prepare itself for aggression, another active aggression by the Israeli regime. So its offensive and defensive capabilities are being prepared for any circumstances. And so those who are criticizing Iran, I think they don't recognize the fact that if conflict starts, it can get very messy, and the Iranians have to be prepared for it. And I think that the fact that it's only Iran that's supporting the resistance, it's Iran that's supporting Yemen, or Hezbollah, or the resistance in Iraq, or Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and it was Iran alongside the Russians for the most part that were preventing ISIS and Al Qaeda from planting the black flags on Damascus. I think people should take that into consideration, that Iran is doing the heavy lifting. Emotional responses are not going to help, and I think that we have to see everything and in an objective manner.
Well, both Israel and the United States, deep inside of their military establishments, have already made note about Yemen alone, Professor Marandi. They've said that this is not an enemy that they say, quote, can be easily deterred, end quote. That is nothing like they have fought before. Ansarallah is considered a relatively small movement in the global picture, at least from the eyes of the arrogant American empire and its allies, though, Professor Marandi. So, what do you make of these comments in light of the fact that we are in a period where many people are questioning the resolve and resilience of the axis of resistance?
Well, Yemen has showed itself to be extraordinarily resilient, and it is very crucially located. And the terrain is very good for defense capabilities. And Yemen has become the Ansarullah, or what the Americans and the Europeans call the Houthis. They've become heroes across the world, and their resilience will be remembered. And the same is true with Hezbollah, which prevented the Israelis from making any inroads whatsoever. And I think we have to sort of go back and look at what happened in Ukraine for a moment. The Western media, all of them were saying that Russia lost the war, that the ruble, Biden said the ruble will be turned into rubble. And we've been hearing that the Russians are losing the war for almost 3 years now. Yet today, all of a sudden, over the last, I don't know, a couple of months maybe, we've seen this sudden shift in the Western media. And suddenly there's an acknowledgement that things are not going well in Yemen, in Ukraine. So, 3 years of Russian in Iran, I would have discussions at with colleagues in think tanks, and many believe that the Russians were losing because, unfortunately, many Iranian elites they read the Washington Post and the New York Times and watch CNN and read Western think tank material, and they don't seek alternative sources so that they could put everything together. And many of them were misled, and they believed that the Russians were losing the war. And people like myself and others were saying that this is misleading, this is propaganda, and we had a very difficult time convincing colleagues, and we failed to do so. At least I failed to do so in many cases. But suddenly, all of these friends of mine are now seeing the reality being very different from what they're being told. So I wouldn't take anything that Netanyahu or the New York Times or the Washington Post, what they say, very seriously. We saw, for example, 60 Minutes gloating over the pager explosions, which killed innocent people, which blinded children. I put up some pictures of them on my Twitter feed today, which blinded a mother This is, I wouldn't take 60 Minutes or ABC or NBC or CBS or or BBC Sky News seriously. And I think those who support the resistance should remain very resilient, and they should never feel demoralized or depressed. The struggle has ups and downs, and you know, in Iran, we've learned to be patient. You probably know that in Iran, in Iranian culture, the the story of the grandson of the prophet in Karbala is something that Iranians are feel very close to, and how he stood against the despot of his era to support the people, and he said no to humiliation. And then when he and his companions were all murdered, they took his sister to the representative of the despot, and he said, how do you see things now? How do you feel?" He was trying to humiliate her, and she said, "I saw nothing but beauty." In other words, their martyrdom, their resistance was beauty in a sense, because resistance is something, legitimate resistance, resistance for a greater cause, is something beautiful. So the horror of Gaza is something that pains us every day, but the fact that so many people, the axis of resistance, are sacrificing for the people of Gaza is something very beautiful indeed. So we have to have patience. We have to keep active. We have to remain active. We have to wake people up. And we see that the Western media has put aside Gaza completely for obvious reasons. So of Western regimes, we have to make sure we're reminding people day and night that the Holocaust continues, in order to further destroy the regime and to humiliate those who support the regime. So I do not share the pessimism of some, and I think that we have to all learn to have more patience. And we really don't have time to be dejected. We have too many. All of us have too many things to do. It's quite clear that the Israeli regime has scored success in Syria. It is a victory of sorts for the regime. There's no doubt about that. And we have Biden and Erdogan to thank for this success. And I know that some are celebrating what happened in Syria, but I think it's quite clear that the side that won the most by far is the Israeli regime. And I don't think we need to go into much detail about that. But that was the objective all along. The dirty war in Syria began in 2011 with the support of terrorist groups and terrorists from across the world, in order to bring down Syria, to strengthen the Israeli regime. That was objective from day one. And although they failed in many ways, they failed to take Lebanon, and they failed to take Iraq. But ultimately, after 13 years, Syria did fall to Al Qaeda. But I think already people are beginning to see things differently. Those who I think were more naive, or those who still believe that the fall of Syria was it's better to have the Israelis celebrating, and to have the Syrian government fall. Um, those who think that the Israeli celebrations are worth it, I think gradually many are beginning to see the reality. They saw how the regime and the Americans began a huge wave of bombings across the country that continue, and the destruction of the country's military and much of the country's critical infrastructure, the occupation of uh, territory, key key mountains and water resources for Syria by the Israeli regime, and the fact that Erdogan and Giuliani have done nothing about it raises a lot of questions. And the abuse that minorities, Christians especially, as the we've some of us have seen the footage. This is beginning to things are beginning to become clearer for those who are, I think, those who've been deceived. But in any case, it is a victory for the Israeli regime. I don't think it's necessary to hide that. But I don't. But I'm not quite sure if it's a long-term victory, because the fall of Syria will have implications across the region. And the countries that are most vulnerable to these extremist groups are, ironically, almost exclusively in the American camp. So, there's no doubt that Saudi Arabia is very uncomfortable about the current situation. There's no doubt that Jordan and Egypt are uncomfortable. In fact, last night, apparently, the so-called revolutionaries in Syria, these Al Qaeda militants and their allies, they were spreading footage of unrest in Egypt, old footage, and pretending as if this was happening. It was happening last night, and some say it was because they were trying to hide the protests that were taking place in Syria. But that aside, the very fact that they are targeting Egypt and putting up old footage of unrest in Egypt, means that these Al Qaeda militants have objectives that go far beyond the borders of Syria. And at the same time, they have huge challenges in Syria. Syrians are uncomfortable, especially about the foreign fighters. And the minorities, which combined constitute half of the country, are all concerned. The Kurds, the Christians, the Alawites, the Shia, the Druze, and many Sunnis, educated class, and people across of all walks of life. They are concerned. So they already have problems. They have there's fighting going on in the areas controlled by the Americans and the Kurds, and or their Kurdish proxies. And Turkey and Qatar have to fund Al Qaeda. The financial burden is on their shoulders. Until now, Iran was sending 60, on average, 60 to 70,000 barrels of oil a day to Syria. Iraq was sending 120,000 barrels of oil a day. The Russians were sending the equivalent of 50 or 60,000 barrels of oil. The Russians were sending refined different fuels, which is even more costly for them. And then, of course, the grain that the Russians were sending, the other support, medicine, and hospital equipment that the Iranians were sending in as aid, that has discontinued. So this huge financial burden for Iran, for Iraq, and for the Russians has ended, and now the burden will be on the Turkish government to deal with a country that is in ruins, thanks to the dirty war that Mr. Erdogan helped initiate along with the West and others. So um, Syria may face changes in the future. It's not clear what will happen, who will control the country. And at the same time, as I said earlier, countries in the American camp are vulnerable, or countries that are seen as being a part of the American camp, they are vulnerable. That this may not end well for the Americans. And if it doesn't end well for the Americans, it definitely doesn't end well for the Israeli regime. And we have to keep in mind that the United States is very busy in Europe. The war is not going well, and the Russians are making rapid advances in Ukraine, and it doesn't seem like Trump is going to be able to end the war on day one, as he promised to do. And the Americans are facing challenges with China, with Panama, and with Canada and Mexico, and all sorts of problems at home. So I don't think it's very smart for the Israeli regime to be celebrating too much. But the reality is that Netanyahu's celebrations are basically so that he could remain in power. Otherwise, I believe that what Netanyahu has done over the last year has delegitimized the Israeli regime in the eyes of the international community. It's shown it to become very weak. Just over the past day, a number of Israeli troops were killed in Gaza, and Yemen has struck again, as you pointed out. And in Lebanon, things are sensitive, very uncertain. The Israeli regime yesterday used a drone to kill 2 ordinary citizens in southern Lebanon. They are constantly violating the ceasefire, as you pointed out, but it just shows that the regime is in trouble, and the Iranians will ultimately punish the Israeli regime. And as I said before, the Iranians are not going to let the Israeli regime to get away with its airstrike on Iran.